Good morning. My name is Sam Coates, and I'm an associate pastor here at Pelham Road Baptist Church. We welcome you to this study. We're going to be looking for the next 4 weeks at the book by N.T. Wright called God and the Pandemic, a Christian reflection on the coronavirus and its aftermath. Some of you probably have already read this book, and I appreciate that. If you've not, I encourage you to go on Amazon or some other site and order the book. It's not a very expensive book. It's an easy read, a short read, but well worth your time. For the next 4 weeks, we're going to be talking about excerpts from the book. I'm not going to read the entire book out loud to you, but we'll look at some different passages and themes in this book. Today we're going to do the first 2 chapters. Where do we start in reading the Old Testament? Next week we'll look at reading the Gospels. The third week we'll look at reading the New Testament. And then the 4th week we'll answer the question, where do we go from here? So I welcome you to this study. When it comes to the coronavirus, there is no safe space on the planet. There's no neutral zone. So we're filled with questions like, does anybody know what's going on here? Why is this happening? Is someone trying to tell us something? And what are we supposed to do about it? In most of the ancient world, and in many parts of the modern world too, major disasters like earthquakes and volcanoes and fires and plagues are regularly associated with the angry gods. Something bad has happened. It must be that someone has it in for you. In the old world of Greece and Rome, the assumption was that you hadn't offered the perfect sacrifice, or you hadn't said the right prayer. Or perhaps today its equivalent would be, I didn't get enough people on Facebook to agree to pray. Or maybe you did something that's so dreadful that even the old amoral gods on Mount Olympus felt it was time to crack down on you. The philosophers of that day didn't think much of that. So they came up with 3 alternatives. First, the Stoics. Everything is programmed to turn out the way it does. You can't change it, so just learn to fit in. Alternatively, the Epicureans say everything is random. You can't do anything about it, so just make yourself comfortable as you can. And then there are the Platonists. They say that the present life is just a shadow of reality. Bad things happen? Yes. And since they do, we're destined for a different world. We also have our modern equivalents. Some say just tough it out. If the bullet's got your name on it, well, so be it. There's nothing you can do. Most of the modern world, here especially in the West, we are implicitly Epicurean. We say, stuff happens and we scramble for comfort. So settle down, self-isolate. There's plenty of Netflix, and this too will pass. Some, including some Christians, opt for Plato. Death isn't the worst thing that can happen. We're headed somewhere else anyway, so let's just be sensible. And please don't shut down the churches or the golf clubs or football. Meanwhile, in refugee camps and in multi-story tower blocks And in the slums, the suffering gets worse, and the sorrow rises, and it begins to shape the question that we hardly dare ask. Why? And what can we do? Out of those two questions, the one that I prefer is not why, but what can we do? Faced with the rapid spread of the coronavirus, many people in churches also have reached for Christian equivalents to these ancient knee-jerk reactions. The world is full of theories. Some in America say it's all China's fault. And some Chinese say it's all America's fault. And no doubt there are thousands of other ideas running around, spreading themselves as easily as the virus itself, and in some ways just as dangerously. The blame game is easy, especially when it is always somebody else's fault. Some people, they think they know exactly what's wrong and what God Himself is trying to say through it all. Some are saying eagerly that this is the sign of the end. The end times industry has been massive in America over the last couple of generations. Many quote the Old Testament prophets to produce their own version of the ancient pagan theory that when bad things happen, it must be God that's done it. We don't believe that, of course, because we know God is love. We'll talk about that a bit more later. Some today are eagerly jumping on this bandwagon, that if bad things happen, then God has done it, because it vilifies their pet hates. It's all the fault of those other people whose identities or lifestyles or views we disapprove. The place we're going to start today is the Old Testament, because that's where some of the apparently key texts can be found. However, let me say also that there are many Christians who see this time as a time of great opportunity to do good. Chapter 2, reading the Old Testament. When it comes to the coronavirus, again, we hear everything from it's all because the government didn't prepare properly for the pandemic, to it's all because the world needs to repent of its sins. We sometimes have the impression that the coronavirus is providing people with a megaphone in which to say more loudly that which they've been wanting to say anyway. Things like the right hollers, we need to repent of sexual sins and abortion. And the left says, we need to repent of the way we treat the poor and the immigrant. In the Hebrew scriptures, the greatest disaster of all times was the Babylonian Exile. And the great prophets interpreted that event in terms of a large-scale punishment for Israel's sin. Listen to that again. The great prophets interpreted that event as a large-scale punishment for Israel's sin. They interpreted the exile in language of God forsaking them and punishing them for worshiping idols. In Lamentations, we read, "Why have you forsaken us completely? Why have you forsaken us these many days? And in the rest of that verse in Lamentations, we read, restore us to yourself, O Lord. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. That's the way they felt and interpreted the events going around them. In the Old Testament, we hear a theology expressed that we often hear even in modern times, especially during plagues, that bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people. The very first psalm informs us of that good people will flourish and the wicked ones will come to a bad end. Psalm 37, which in some ways is an extended meditation on that same theme, has this striking verse. I have been young and I am now old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken. In other words, God protects righteous people. But I'm not so sure we've always seen that even in our own lives and families. I know I have a friend who was the picture of a righteous family. He married his high school sweetheart. They had many children. They found a job working with the Billy Graham Association. They were involved in many, many service ministries, including taking in foreign exchange students. They did everything right. We would call them a righteous family. However, on their way to the beach one summer, almost their entire family was killed in an automobile accident, including the foreign exchange students they were housing. It was such a tragic event. So, it gets us to thinking about that kind of verse that says that God protects righteous people. Try explaining that to someone dying of the coronavirus in a crowded refugee camp, that all of this is because of some sin. Blame the victim, in other words. That's always a popular line. But fortunately for our sanity and our view of biblical inspiration, there is a more rounded picture in the Old Testament and the Psalms themselves. Take Psalm 73. The writer knows the normal line that good things come to good people and bad things come to bad. But it hasn't always worked out like that. In Psalm 73, he says, the wicked are flourishing and the righteous are crushed under their feet. Then go to Psalm 44, which specifically denies the good brings good, bad brings bad viewpoint. The poet knows that God has looked after his people in times past, but now truly horrible things have happened, despite the fact that he insists, quote, all this has come upon us, yet we have not forsaken you. We have not forgotten you or been false to your covenant. Then, of course, we have the book of Job. When everyone tells you that the coronavirus means that God is calling people to repent, tell them to read the book of Job. The whole point is that is not the point. It is Job's comforters who tell him it's all about sin. They are absolutely clear that God must be punishing Job for some secret misbehavior. And Job is equally clear that if that is so, then God must be unjust. But the reader is in on the secret from the start, and he knows that both are wrong, but that the comforters are a whole lot more wrong than Job. Job longs for justice and for God to put things right. And the story of Israel is the story of God's covenant and his partnering with the human race to rescue and to restore creation. This story is picked up in the great prayer that we find in Daniel 9 of God's healing and rescue and restoration and new creation following after a time not only of judgment, but of great despair. So, alongside this Israel and God's story, there runs the deeper story of the good creation and the dark power that has tried to destroy God's good handiwork. We are simply to know that when we are caught up in awful circumstances, apparent gross injustices, even terrible plagues and pandemics, or when we are accused of wicked things of which we are innocent, when we're suffering from strange sicknesses for no apparent reason, let alone a cure. At those points, we are to do what often the psalmist did, and that is to lament. It's all right for us to complain, to state our case before God, and then, as I always say, leave it to God. Trust God with life. God himself declares at the end of Job that he knows the truth. Job has clung on to the fact that God's mercy and God's justice is there even in his own misery. Jesus not only drew on that story, he lived it. Jesus died under it. And that will bring us then next week to the story of Jesus himself. Now, if you don't mind, let me kind of put a PS thought to those two chapters. Remember that ancient peoples did not know the science that germs cause disease. So no wonder they interpreted disease as the wrath of God. They had no understanding of weather systems like we do today. So no wonder they interpreted things like droughts or hurricanes or tornadoes as God's wrath or punishment. And also remember that ancient peoples did not have any understanding of the permissive will of God. That we live in a world of natural laws like gravity and inertia. And when we come into conflict with these natural laws, tragic things can and they do happen. God permits these things to happen. But my friends that died in that car accident died not because it was God's will or because they were unrighteous people. It died because something and someone broke the law of inertia. Do you remember that law? It says that if a body is at rest or moving at a constant speed and will remain at rest or keep moving at a constant speed unless it is acted upon by a force. And in their great tragedy, that force was a semi-truck that veered head-on into their lane. Their deaths were not God's will. It was a part of his permissive will because laws of nature were broken. And I know that God grieved deeply for their deaths as well. But God does have an ultimate will. And we know that ultimate will because we see it in the life of Jesus. Jesus, as we say, is the best look of God we've ever had. We believe in the Trinity. And Jesus was always willing life, abundant life, health, and healing. He never willed that people be sick or suffer. So when people get sick, or even more tragic, die from this coronavirus, that is not God's ultimate will that this happen. Remember, Jesus said that the rain falls both on the good and the evil. And the Old Testament acknowledges that as well. We'll look at that connected to the tower story next week. Appreciate your being with us today. Next Sunday, we're going to look at chapter 3 in this book called Jesus and the Gospels. And the Gospels will help us answer the question, why doesn't God step in and stop this? Why would God ever allow this? And then Jesus is going to help us redefine what it means for God to be in control, or that God is taking charge. Remember, God can use all sorts of things to alert us to things that we need to see. See you next Sunday.